name is Dave Dobson. I was named by the Saugeen First Nation in their legal action to claim a portion of Sauble Beach in 1995. I have been researching the Saugeen Band's claim for many years, and I have produced this video to visually explain why the Saugeen Band's claim is not valid. To give you a better perspective of what I'm talking about, let's get our geographical bearings. Sauble Beach is located on the eastern shore of Lake Huron in Ontario, Canada, approximately a 2.5-hour drive by car northwest of Toronto. The Saugeen First Nation claim that a portion of the actual beach, approximately 1.5 miles in length, from the dividing line of Lot 2526 at Main Street to midpoint Lot 31, was never surrendered during the signing of Treaty 72 in 1854. The current boundaries of the Saugeen Reserve, looking north, as surveyed by Charles Rankin in 1855, are outlined in red in this photo from Google Maps. The same area claimed by the Saugeen Band that I showed previously looking west can be seen in this view looking north, represented by this line. This is the October 12, 1855 draft map, the most important piece of evidence to support the claim of the Saugeen Band. At first glance, it is difficult to believe that this map could cause so much controversy. But let me zoom in on one significant feature that makes this map stand out. The notation and post found at midpoint Lot 31 at the shore of Lake Huron. Most, myself included, would agree that this notation was meant to read Northeast Angle Indian Reserve, which would seem to leave little doubt that this is where the Saugeen Reserve's northeast corner is supposed to terminate. But let's keep in mind that this is a draft map, a working reference tool used by Rankin and his surveying team, not a representation of Rankin's final work. I can't emphasize this point enough. This is a draft map, not the accepted and certified final map. No researchers from today have been able to match the terms of Treaty 72 to the Saugeen boundaries illustrated on any of the maps produced in the 1855 survey by Chief Surveyor Charles Rankin. Of the maps he did produce, not one shows a physically drawn borderline terminating the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve at midpoint Lot 31. In 2017, I was the first to match the treaty terms to Charles Rankin's final map, which was accepted as the official plan by Indian Affairs in 1856. The evidence that led to matching the treaty terms to the final map doesn't just conclusively prove the Saugeen Band received the boundaries they had negotiated. It also explains why the vague notation on the 1855 draft survey map holds no relevance in establishing midpoint Lot 31 as the Saugeen Reserve's northeast corner termination point. In 2017, an Ontario land surveyor with fresh eyes on the boundary problem pointed out to me that the measurement from Copway Road to Lot 2526 Main Street falls within the treaty definition of about 9.5 miles. Without the benefit of the research and musings of others that precede this report, I would not have had the epiphany in 2017 that in order for the treaty terms to match Rankin's final map, it is necessary and correct to merge the Copway Road Amendment instructions with the original instructions from Treaty 72. There are 5 main issues to understanding Charles Rankin's survey. They are: 1. Establishing where the 1855 Saugeen Band believed they initially agreed their treaty-negotiated boundaries of 1854 were to be located. 2. Correctly interpreting the convoluted wording of Treaty 72 regarding the Saugeen First Nation reserve boundaries. 3. Explaining the significance or insignificance of the Northeast Angle Indian Reserve notation located at midpoint Lot 31 on the 1855 draft map. 4. Correctly interpreting how the Copway Road Amendment altered the original intention for the Saugeen First Nation reserve boundaries, specifically the 9.5-mile shoreline measurement, and the northern extent of the eastern boundary. 5. Correctly interpreting what was meant by this change will give the Saugeen Indians a small increase in frontage on Lake Huron, stated in the Copway Road Amendment. Most of these complications could have been avoided right from the beginning, had the evidence been interpreted properly. The most dramatic misinterpretations that altered the course of this land claim investigation involve two items from the Copway Road Amendment evidence. First, Charles Rankin declared that the Copway Road Amendment could be carried out without altering the terms of the treaty in any way. Saugeen First Nation researchers of today interpreted this as supporting the Saugeen Band's claim, and that the original instructions of the treaty were to be followed word for word, meaning the 9.5-mile shoreline measurement was to begin from the original western boundary, where it is bounded to Lake Huron. This is not what Rankin meant. Saugeen First Nation researchers confused Rankin's statement of terms of the treaty to mean the actual wording of the treaty would not be altered in any way. This is incorrect. In fact, it is necessary and correct to merge the wording from the Copway Road Amendment with the original treaty instructions in order for the terms of the treaty to remain intact. The second misinterpretation. The September 1855 Copway Road Amendment clearly states that the western boundary is no longer to be bounded to Lake Huron as described in the original treaty instructions, but instead, the western boundary is to be bounded to Lake Huron at Copway Road. This is a very significant change, since it establishes Copway Road as the new starting point for the 9.5-mile shoreline measurement. Experts working on behalf of Saugeen First Nation assumed the Copway Road Amendment's purpose was to give more territory to the Saugeen Band, based on the statement from the amendment that said, "This change will give the Saugeen Indians a small increase of frontage on Lake Huron." This led them to believe the distance and change, as a result of relocating the western boundary, would be in addition to the original description of the 9.5-mile shoreline measurement. An opposing expert was very close to exposing the folly of the Saugeen First Nation argument. Unfortunately, he assumed the original instructions were to be followed as stated rather than merged as well. However, he did recognize that since the eastern boundary could not be contained within a block of land north from Lot 26 to midpoint Lot 31, it was impossible for the shoreline boundary to continue past the dividing line of Lot 25-26. Because of this impossibility, he explained, is why Rankin simply intended to terminate the reserve at Lot 25-26. Even though this conclusion was logical and for the most part correct, it left the impression that the Saugeen First Nation didn't receive the 9.5-mile shoreline boundary they were promised. While these misinterpretations are very slight, and perhaps even understandable, it changes the whole meaning and purpose of the Copway Road Amendment. As a result, no one uncovered that the current Saugeen First Nation shoreline boundary from Copway Road to Lot 25-26 Main Street also equals almost exactly 9.5 miles, or about 9.5 miles. This could not be a magical coincidence. During negotiations of the Copway Road Amendment in August 1855, Charles Rankin reported to Lord Bury. In that report, he referred to a drawing and made the comment, "The red narrow line is the place of a line of a road formerly cut out for the use of the Indians, and then called Copway Road. They profess to have believed at the time of the treaty that this road was to form the northeast limit of this portion of the surrender, and still desire to retain all to the north of it." This statement establishes that, right from the beginning of negotiations, the 1855 Saugeen Band believed that the reserve's western boundary was to be bound to Lake Huron at Copway Road. This also establishes that, to be in accordance with the treaty, the 1855 Saugeen Band also believed that the 9.5-mile shoreline measurement was to begin at Copway Road. This being the case, according to the 1855 Saugeen Band's understanding of the original intent of the treaty, the 9.5-mile measurement should terminate at lot 2526, exactly where it is today. That was the purpose of the Copway Road Amendment, to give the Saugeen Band what they believed they had originally negotiated. An associate drew my attention to some compelling evidence related to my boundary dispute research in a book called The History of the Saugeen Indians by Peter Schmaltz. While we know the Saugeen First Nation believed from the beginning Copway Road was to make up the reserve's western boundary, it begs the question, why was there such a discrepancy between what Saugeen First Nation believed their western boundary should be and what Indian Affairs believed it should be? After all, the treaty was signed and the treaty instructions regarding the Saugeen Reserve were accepted as stated. One might think the problem was due to a language barrier, and quite possibly this could have been a factor, but for the most part, the discrepancy was a result of a very significant mistake made by Lawrence Oliphant, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1854. I will paraphrase how Peter Schmaltz describes this mistake in his book. Lawrence Oliphant was the government official who negotiated Treaty 72. While establishing the Copway Road line, Oliphant was without a compass and simply considered the road to run due north when it actually runs in a northwesterly direction. Oliphant was fully aware Saugeen First Nation desired Copway Road as their western boundary, and he had full intention of granting them their wish. When Oliphant made the instruction that the western boundary was to run in a due north straight line from the Saugeen River, he was incorrectly thinking he was making a direct reference to Copway Road. As a result, both Charles Rankin and George Gould on two separate occasions positioned the western boundary incorrectly since Oliphant deemed it unnecessary to mention Copway Road as the intended survey marker in the original treaty instructions. The resulting positioning of the western boundary infuriated the Saugeen Band. Oliphant's simple yet very significant mistake of not identifying the proper direction of Copway Road led to considerable problems for the Rankin Survey in 1855, and is what has ultimately led to the boundary dispute we are having today. What did the treaty say, and did the reserve boundaries change with the Copway Road Amendment? The most significant instruction in relation to the Saugeen First Nation's current claim to Sauble Beach is the first one, which describes the location and extent of the western boundary. The original treaty instruction is this: all that block of land bounded on the west by a straight line running due north from the river Saugeen, at the spot where it is entered by a ravine immediately to the west of the village, and over which a bridge has recently been constructed, to the shore of Lake Huron. That entire description adds up to one straight line, and the intended 9.5-mile shoreline measurement was to begin here. However, the Copway Road Amendment states that the 9.5-mile measurement is no longer to begin at this point, but instead is to begin at Copway Road. This requires merging the Copway Road instruction with the first instruction from Treaty 72. The merged instruction reads as follows: all that block of land bounded on the west by the Indian path called the Copway Road, which takes a northwesterly direction to the shore of Lake Huron, from a straight line running due north from the river Saugeen, at the spot where it is entered by a ravine immediately to the west of the village, and over which a bridge has recently been constructed. The 9.5-mile measurement therefore begins at Copway Road. But what about the northeast angle Indian Reserve notation located at midpoint Lot 31 on the 1855 draft map? First, we must analyze Charles Rankin's perspective and actions. Since the Saugeen First Nation dispute of the western boundary didn't occur until late May of 1855, we know that it was Charles Rankin's belief from October 1854 until almost June of 1855 that the original treaty instructions were to be followed. We also know that Rankin traversed the Lake Huron shoreline from the mouth of the Saugeen River to the mouth of the Sauble River in late October 1854, marking off some 60 distances of the contours of the shoreline along the way. He then surveyed the eastern boundary of the tongue of the town plot in early November, which also represented the western boundary of the Saugeen Reserve. No one knows for sure when, or even specifically why, Rankin made the notation Northeast Angle Indian Reserve at midpoint Lot 31. It is most logical that he made the notation between October 1854 and May 1855, and more likely closer to October 1854. After all, he had just traversed and measured the Lake Huron shoreline with the original treaty instructions from the same month of October still fresh in his mind. However, he could have made the notation later than May 1855. One expert pointed out that Rankin used the midpoint Lot 31 location as a starting point to locate the true northeast terminus of the Saugeen Reserve, where the shore meets land 1.4 miles south, just inside the dividing line of Lot 2526. From this perspective, Rankin could have made the notation in early September 1855, when he was surveying the eastern boundary. Regardless, whatever his motivation was for making the notation and when are irrelevant in supporting midpoint Lot 31 as the intended northeast terminus of the Saugeen Reserve. After the Copway Road Amendment, the final intent of the treaty was to terminate the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve at Lot 2526 Main Street. Therefore, even if the Northeast Angle Indian Reserve notation indicates Treaty 72's original intent for the location of the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve, it holds no relevance in determining the final, amended intent of Treaty 72 for locating the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve. To prove the Northeast Angle Indian Reserve notation is a non-factor in determining the intent of Treaty 72, it is time to match the terms of Treaty 72's amended Saugeen First Nation boundary to Rankin's final map of 1856. The ultimate proof Saugeen First Nation received the reserve boundaries they had negotiated and were promised. So what are the terms of the treaty? Term number 1. The western boundary is to be bound to Lake Huron, and its origin is from a straight line running due north from a ravine located at the Saugeen River. Term 2. The southern boundary is to run along the northern portion of the recently surrendered strip. Term number 3. The shoreline boundary is to be measured along the coast for 9.5 miles and is to begin from where the western boundary is bound to Lake Huron. Term number 4. The eastern boundary is to run south from where the shoreline boundary terminates at the coast, and then run parallel to the western boundary until it reaches the northern portion of the recently surrendered strip. Term number 5. When all the boundaries are connected, they are to make up a block of land. To prove the listed terms match Rankin's final and official map, I will use the merged treaty instructions to match the illustrated outline of the Saugeen Reserve found on Rankin's final and official map of 1856. I will then compare the results to the required treaty terms listed on the screen to prove Rankin's final illustration is in compliance. Instruction 1. All that block of land bounded on the west by the Indian path called the Copway Road, which takes a northwesterly direction to the shore of Lake Huron from a straight line running due north from the River Saugeen at the spot where it is entered by a ravine immediately to the west of the village and over which a bridge has recently been constructed. Instruction 2. On the south by the aforesaid northern limit of the lately surrendered strip. Instruction 3. On the east by a line drawn from a spot upon the coast at a distance of about 9.5 miles from the western boundary aforesaid. Instruction 4. And running parallel thereto until it touches the aforementioned northern limit of the recently surrendered strip. It is important to point out that the western boundary still runs due north to where Copway Road begins, which enables the eastern boundary to be on the same due north direction, making it parallel to the western boundary, even though most of the western boundary runs in a northwesterly direction along Copway Road. Now I will test Rankin's illustrated outline that you see on his final map to see if it conforms to the terms of the treaty. The western boundary is bound to Lake Huron, and it originates from a straight line running due north from a ravine located at the Saugeen River. This is a match. The southern boundary does run along the northern portion of the recently surrendered strip. This is a match. The shoreline boundary does equal 9.5 miles, which can easily be verified if there is any doubt. It also begins where the western boundary is bound to Lake Huron at Copway Road, as instructed in the amendment. This is also a match. The eastern boundary does begin where the shoreline boundary terminates at the coast at lot 2526, and does run south parallel to the straight line portion of the western boundary. It terminates at the northern portion of the recently surrendered strip. This is a match, and all of the boundaries are contained within a block of land. This is the final match in order to meet all the requirements of the terms of Treaty 72. As I previously stated, the Copway Road Amendment didn't change the terms of the treaty, but it did add more words, which changed the first instruction. The shoreline measurement is still 9.5 miles, still agreeing with the terms. It just begins from a different location. When the amendment wording is merged with the original treaty wording, the description is a perfect match to what Rankin illustrated the Saugeen Reserve boundaries to be on the 1856 final and official map, submitted to and accepted by Indian Affairs. Considering the amended treaty terms identically match the 1856 final map, the next problem to discuss is not so much a problem as it is a housekeeping issue for clarification. Clarification of what was meant by this change will give the Saugeen Indians a small increase in frontage on Lake Huron, stated in the Copway Road Amendment. It has already been established that in 1855 it was impossible for the shoreline frontage to exist from Lot 26 to midpoint Lot 31 to enable the eastern boundary of the Saugeen Reserve to extend any further north. Therefore, we also know it is impossible for the increase in frontage mentioned in the amendment to be in addition to a 9.5 mile measurement that includes the distance between Lot 26 and midpoint Lot 31. Having established that, we also have to realize that since there is no one left alive from the Rankin survey, any further discussion on this topic is pure speculation. However, based on the evidence, I will offer two explanations that would appear to be the most logical. Explanation 1. In 2016, I found Charles Rankin's January 1855 Grey Bruce map. It was never used as evidence by other researchers, but its importance is that it illustrates how early on Rankin considered Lot 2526 Main Street to be the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve. It is also the only Rankin map that shows the original western boundary as a solid line, since it predates the Saugeen Band's western boundary uprising in May of 1855. Even in the absence of the lots, if the scale of the map is used, it can be calculated that the northeast boundary of the Saugeen Reserve terminates at Lot 2526. Therefore, we know that it was as early as January 1855 that Rankin considered Lot 2526 the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve, just 2 months after three significant events: the signing of Treaty 72, Rankin's traverse of the Lake Huron shoreline, and Rankin's personal survey of the western boundary in November. It was later resurveyed by Assistant George Gould in May of 1855. Based on this knowledge, we know that when Rankin was spearheading the negotiations for the Copway Road Amendment, he would be doing so knowing his intention was to terminate the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve at Lot 2526 Main Street. This means that before the Copway Road Amendment was even considered, Rankin's intention was to create a shoreline boundary that measured 8.1 miles in length. Knowing Rankin's intentions and considering his close involvement with the Copway Road Amendment, if the increase in frontage mentioned is, in fact, the distance between the original western boundary and Copway Road, it is only in addition to the 8.1 miles Rankin was intending, which would bring it back to the originally negotiated 9.5 miles. Therefore, since it is impossible for frontage to exist between Lot 26 and midpoint Lot 31, the increase referred to is in addition to 8.1 miles, not in addition to 9.5 miles. This argument is definitely a firm possibility, but in my opinion, there is an even more likely explanation. Explanation 2. Considering the small increase in distance was never identified in the amendment, it is more likely that the increase was so small that it still fell within the about 9.5 mile definition from the treaty, leaving it unnecessary to identify the actual distance. Even though today we consider 1.4 miles a relatively small distance, if the increase was intended to be in addition to a boundary that is only 9.5 miles in distance to begin with, a 1.4 mile increase is quite significant. It is difficult to believe a distance of that length would not be identified in the Copway Road Amendment, particularly when you consider that in the same memorandum that contained the Copway Road Amendment, as little as 1 and 2 mile increases or decreases in frontage in the Cape Croker Amendment were located and described in detail. The about 9.5 mile definition of the Saugeen Reserve shoreline leaves considerable wiggle room for any small increases in frontage, and therefore it would be unnecessary for an actual distance to be identified. Regardless of which explanation makes the most sense, they are both reasonable arguments. Considering the evidence, both arguments support the history and the outcome of the Copway Road Amendment. Think about the Saugeen First Nation's explanation. The increase in frontage as a result of relocating the western boundary is in addition to a 9.5 mile shoreline boundary that inexplicably includes a 1.25 mile stretch where it is impossible for frontage to exist. There is no way to make any sense of this argument. It is important to understand the significance of matching the amended treaty terms to Rankin's final and official map of 1856. It makes the argument that Rankin surveyed the eastern boundary incorrectly irrelevant. The 9.5 mile shoreline measurement from Copway Road terminates at Lot 2526 Main Street, which also marks the starting point of the eastern boundary running south. Even if you could prove some improper method was used to survey the eastern boundary, it has no bearing on any of the other lots north of the dividing line at Lot 2526 Main Street. The 9.5 mile shoreline measurement stops the eastern boundary from extending any further north of this location. The improper surveying of this eastern boundary argument, along with the original intent of the 9.5 mile shoreline measurement terminating at midpoint Lot 31, are both inconsequential in supporting the Saugeen First Nation claim to Sauble Beach. The Copway Road Amendment argument matches the amended terms of Treaty 72 to the final and official map Rankin submitted to Indian Affairs in 1856. This is the ultimate evidence in proving Saugeen First Nation received the reserve boundaries they were promised. The 1855 Saugeen Band didn't dispute and disrupt the survey of the western boundary in May of 1855 to gain more territory. They simply wanted what they believed they had negotiated. At the time of the Saugeen Band's western boundary dispute, the eastern boundary had not yet been surveyed. When it was surveyed in September of 1855, and the northeast corner of the reserve was located at Lot 2526 without further dispute, this is a clear statement that the Saugeen Band were satisfied they had received what they were promised. Alternately, Indian Affairs didn't grant the Saugeen Band an amendment to the treaty as an appeasement to offer more territory to stop the disruption of the survey. What would be the motivation for Indian Affairs to grant the Saugeen Band more territory that they had not asked for? To illustrate how simple the history of the survey of the Saugeen Reserve is when it is properly interpreted, I will summarize the whole boundary dispute issue in just a few sentences. The Saugeen Band of 1855 complained the western boundary was positioned incorrectly. Indian Affairs agreed, and the western boundary was relocated. As a result, the western boundary was no longer bound to Lake Huron from a due north straight line. It was bound to Lake Huron at Copway Road. By definition of the treaty terms, this affected the 9.5-mile shoreline boundary starting point. As a result, the 9.5-mile shoreline boundary no longer starts here and ends at midpoint Lot 31. It starts at Copway Road and ends at Lot 2526 Main Street. The explanation to this boundary dispute is no more complicated than that. It is the most consistent explanation using the available historical facts. Following this simple chain of documented events I have just described is the only, I repeat, the only explanation that allows for the treaty terms to match Charles Rankin's final map. Conclusive proof, Treaty 72 not only honored the terms of the treaty, but also honored the reserve boundaries Saugeen First Nation desired and believed they had negotiated in 1854. In 1855, the Saugeen Band had a legitimate boundary dispute. It was dealt with and corrected over 160 years ago, and the boundary dispute of today is no more than a manipulation of the facts and the truth. There is nowhere else to look other than the Copway Road Amendment argument for a resolution to this boundary dispute. In August 2019, Ms. Jane Deeks, a press secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations, revealed to the Owen Sound Sun-Times that the federal government had reviewed a similar, more comprehensive presentation I had submitted to what you have just viewed. She claimed the presentation had no effect in changing the federal government's position in supporting Saugeen First Nation's boundary dispute. The way I have interpreted Rankin's Copway Road Amendment declaration that the terms of the treaty are not to be altered in any way leads to an undeniable match of the terms of Treaty 72 to Rankin's final map, yet the federal government sees no significance to this. The federal government sees no significance of my explanation that the relocation of the western boundary to Copway Road would also relocate the 9.5-mile shoreline termination point from midpoint Lot 31 to Lot 2526, exactly where it is illustrated to be on Rankin's final map and remains today. The very fact that the shoreline measurement from Copway Road to Lot 2526 Main Street equals the distance of the treaty term of about 9.5 miles. It would be hard not to recognize this as something more than just a strange coincidence. The federal government was never before aware of this, but it doesn't impress them. The federal government of Canada, a named defendant in this lawsuit, still believes the Saugeen First Nations argument is more in line with the facts. We are talking about an argument that relies exclusively on the original treaty instructions for its support, an argument that completely writes off the Copway Road Amendment as an isolated, separate event from Rankin's survey of the Saugeen Reserve boundaries, an argument that relies on the original treaty instructions, yet ignores that, for their argument to be correct, it requires violating 3 of the treaty terms. 1. The original treaty instructions do not allow the boundaries of the Saugeen Reserve to be contained within a block of land from Lot 2526 to midpoint Lot 31. The very first 5 words of the treaty instructions regarding the Saugeen Reserve are all that block of land. If the original treaty instructions were used, this area would exist outside of a block of land in Lake Huron. 2. For the Saugeen argument to be correct, in order for land to exist between Lot 2526 and midpoint Lot 31, the eastern boundary would have to deviate off the treaty-instructed due north line that runs parallel to the western boundary. And 3. While I realize the Saugeen First Nation argument does not recognize the Copway Road Amendment as a contributing factor to the final outline of the reserve boundaries, you can't just ignore facts. One of the terms of the treaty is that the shoreline measurement is to begin where the western boundary is bound to Lake Huron, which, after the Copway Road Amendment, is Copway Road. Saugeen First Nation's argument accommodates for a shoreline distance from Copway Road to midpoint Lot 31 that equals 11 miles, an obvious violation of the treaty term of 9.5 miles. If the treaty violations are not enough, the Saugeen First Nation's argument cannot match the original treaty terms on which their argument exclusively relies to any map, not Rankin's final map, or more importantly, the 1855 draft map with the northeast angle Indian Reserve notation at midpoint Lot 31. None of the arguments from the expert reports have matched the treaty terms to any of Rankin's maps either. In other words, no other research the federal government has seen or ever been made aware of has been able to match the terms of Treaty 72 to any of Rankin's maps, but most significant, his final and official map. Yet, after all these years, when they are finally presented with evidence that can, it has no effect on them, doesn't even raise an eyebrow. I ask you, how can any other argument even be given consideration over the one, the only one that can match the treaty terms to Rankin's final map? So what about the documentation that seemingly corroborates the Saugeen claim? Having matched the treaty instructions to Rankin's final map, very little needs to be said beyond this point. It is difficult to give much credence to evidence which is secondary when the treaty terms have already been matched to the final map. However, since ANAC presented evidence that they declare corroborates the Saugeen claim, I will address these issues now. In 1856, Rideout and Schreiber, an engineering company, were doing survey work of their own at the Sauble River, the same year Charles Rankin submitted his final map to Indian Affairs. It is assumed that this company found the actual survey stake at midpoint Lot 31 and noted what was written on it. Their survey map has a notation at the Lot 31 post that reads, marked as northeast angle of Saugeen Reserve according to treaty boundary running south. Notations of this length on a post would be very unusual in Rankin's time, so whether Rideout and Schreiber were told the meaning of the survey stake, perhaps by Rankin himself, or they visually saw the notation on the post, it cannot be determined. There is a word following the word marked, and it appears to be as. I would interpret this to mean the location is marked as, not the actual post. No matter how it was conveyed to them, the notation is actually quite logical and makes sense, but it doesn't support the Saugeen Band's argument. Since notations on posts of this length were not the norm in Rankin's time, the first question I asked myself when I began analyzing it was, why is this notation so long, and does it make sense? At first I said no, but the more I repeated it to myself, the more it made sense considering the events surrounding the Rankin survey. If the notation on the survey post was to mark the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve, why would they add the words according to treaty boundary? Why go to all that effort to mark a post in this manner? Why wouldn't you simply mark it in the same way the 1855 draft map was marked, if it held the same meaning? Because it doesn't hold the same meaning. The 1855 draft map marks the same position in a concise manner. It simply says Northeast Angle Indian Reserve. When examining the physical post found at Lot 31, you would expect the post to appear something like this illustration I've created, especially since there are several examples of surveying teams marking Indian reserves in this manner throughout Ontario. By adding the phrase, according to treaty boundary, it implies there is another location to be considered. Bearing in mind what I discussed about the Copway Road Amendment, the other boundary to consider is the relocation of the northeast corner to Lot 2526, Main Street. It is difficult to believe that Rankin would go to all the trouble of marking a post with an extravagant notation when he could simply match the map notation to the post notation as illustrated. When you visualize the post with the long notation as illustrated, it makes it almost unbelievable that this would have been done. Anak and the Saugeen Band also argue that Rankin's field notes, which were written by George Gould, refer to the midpoint Lot 31 post as the Indian boundary when identifying the location of the side road between Lot 30 and Lot 31. This is very misleading and selective information considering everything else contained in the field notes. Anak refers to one specific page from the field notes to substantiate the Saugeen claim. They don't mention any of the pages in the field notes that describe the side roads as you head north from the southern position of the Saugeen Reserve's eastern boundary. These pages don't corroborate or match what Anak is trying to prove with the Lot 30-31 side road field note page. Between lots 5 and 6, the side road runs 82 chains, 76 links from the concession C and ends with a post staked at the Indian boundary and marked with an X on the 1855 draft map. Between lots 10 and 11, the side road runs 78 chains, 65 links from concession C and ends with a post staked at the Indian boundary and marked with an X on the map. Between lots 15 and 16, the side road runs 75 chains, 8 links from concession C and ends with a post staked at the Indian boundary and marked with an X on the map. Between lots 20 and 21, the side road runs 70 chains, 92 links from concession C and ends with a post staked at the Indian boundary and marked with an X on the map. Between lot 2526 Main Street, Lake Huron is referenced where the side road ends. It simply says that a post was planted 1.56 chains or 103 feet from Lake Huron, but on the 1855 draft map, the X that marks the post is in the lake. No mention of an Indian boundary whatsoever. This means the side road at lot 2526 ends at Lake Huron, since it was Rankin's practice to place posts well inland from the lake so they would not be washed away. Between lots 30 and 31, the note reads that the side road ends 62 chains, 54 links from concession C at a post that is 1 chain, 72 links, or 114 feet from Lake Huron, a similar distance from the lake as is at lot 2526. Again, so the post won't be washed away by the lake. The lot 30-31 post has the added distinction that it is 10 chains south of post of Indian Reserve. It doesn't say 10 chains south of the Indian Reserve or 10 chains south of the Indian Reserve's northeast boundary. It says south of post of Indian Reserve. If indeed there was an Indian boundary 10 chains south, as Anak and the Saugeen Band claim, the lot 30-31 side road should have ended at the Indian boundary and marked with an X on the 1855 draft map, the same way the other side roads south of lot 2526 Main Street are recorded. The notation 10 chains south of post of Indian Reserve is simply a reference to the post Rankin used to find the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve. The post itself is the only thing that holds any distinction to the Indian Reserve. The post is not referenced as post of Indian Reserve's northeast boundary, and the lot 30-31 side road, 10 chains south of the post, doesn't end at the Indian boundary. It ends at Lake Huron, just like lot 2526. Furthermore, if we look at the field note page that describes the line of the Saugeen Reserve's eastern boundary, the title page is labeled Indian Boundary, west side of concession D. The 1855 draft map proves that there is nothing west of concession D other than Lake Huron from lot 26 to the post at midpoint Lot 31. If you were to extend the eastern boundary line on the final map, you would find the same thing. There is no Indian boundary whatsoever west of Concession D shown on the 1855 draft map until you start heading south at the dividing line of Lot 2526. These comparisons of the field note notations to the 1855 draft map are just as conclusive that the Saugeen Reserve's eastern boundary ends at Lot 2526 as the Copway Road to Main Street measurement equaling 9.5 miles. Consider this. The midpoint Lot 31 post referred to as Post of Indian Reserve in the field notes was the starting point Rankin used to enable him to create the true north line. The line used to locate the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve 1.4 miles south at Lot 2526 Main Street. The same location where the field notes describe the Lot 2526 side road as ending at Lake Huron. He continued the eastern boundary on that same line south for another 7.5 miles to mark the eastern boundary of the Saugeen Reserve. The post at midpoint Lot 31 also represents the original intended location for the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve. The post, what it initially represented, and what it eventually was used for, was all in relation to the Saugeen Reserve's boundary. For Rankin and his assistant George Gould to refer to the midpoint Lot 31 post as the Post of Indian Reserve is hardly any kind of revelation, particularly when all the side roads south of Lot 2526 end at an actual Indian boundary line that can be matched to Rankin's field notes. Rankin himself seemingly refers to the portion of beach from the Sauble River to Main Street as the Indian boundary. On September 4, 1855, Rankin and his men surveyed from the mouth of the Sauble River to just inside the northern boundary of Lot 25. This from Rankin's diary dated September 4, 1855. Commenced and ran down 2 miles on boundary of Saugeen Indian Reserve. We know that it is approximately 2 miles from the Sauble River to Lot 2526. We also know that the mouth of the Sauble River to midpoint Lot 31 is most definitely not part of the Saugeen Reserve boundary. Yet it sounds as if Rankin is referring to this portion as the Indian boundary. Overwhelming evidence, including the field notes, confirm that from Lot 31 to Lot 2526 Main Street is also not part of the Saugeen boundary. Therefore, Rankin's entry of commenced and ran down 2 miles has to mean to get to the Saugeen boundary. Rankin continues in his diary, and afterwards left the camp together with Claudia Skiing to return to the village to give general superintendence to other matters connected with the survey, leaving Gould to proceed with the Indian boundary and other parts of Amabel. 2 miles from the mouth of the Sauble River heading south puts you at Lot 2526. Rankin is at Lot 2526 when he makes his statement in his diary, and that is where their work is finished for that day. They stopped work for the day in the exact same location the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve is identified as terminating on Rankin's final map. The exact same location where Rankin left Gould to proceed with the eastern boundary of the Saugeen Reserve heading south. The exact same location that is about 9.5 miles from the northwest position of the western boundary at Copway Road. The exact same location by scale that marks the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve on the Grey Bruce map. The same location the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve is shown to be on the 1855 draft map. These are not magical coincidences. These are the facts that confirm the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve terminates at Lot 2526. The last piece of evidence that Anak advertises as corroboration of the Saugeen claim is the Huff letter. Livingston Huff wrote a letter to Indian Affairs back in 1932, claiming that the shore in front of his lot, Lot 26, was part of the Saugeen Reserve. Mr. Huff was explicit in defining what he thought the boundary was. This is his description. We wanted the land right to the water, but there was about 10 acres between our lot and Lake Huron that was claimed as Indian Reserve, and the white people were made move off that strip right to the Sauble River. The first thing about this letter that jumps out at you right away is that this description does not match what the Saugeen Band is claiming. Livingston Huff says that the reserve is from Lot 26 to the Sauble River, and it equals 10 acres in total. The Saugeen Band claim that their reserve boundary should extend to midpoint Lot 31, and it is the exact width of the beach. Since Mr. Huff was kind enough to give the detail of 10 acres, I used this calculation to find exactly what his description equaled. Using this method to calculate the width of the shoreline Mr. Huff describes, I could identify what it equaled in feet. To illustrate this, Huff's description has the reserve going from Lot 2526 to the Sauble River at a width of 37.5 feet at the shoreline. The Saugeen Band claim the reserve extends from Lot 2526 to midpoint Lot 31, with the entire beach as the width. Hardly a matching description that can be considered corroboration of the Saugeen Band's claim. However, the Special Fishery License of 1874 is very close to matching what Mr. Huff is describing. The Saugeen Band purchased a Special Fishery License for the annual sum of $10 for a period of at least 10 years, from 1874 to 1884, described in the license as the area between the north side of the Sauble River and the dividing line of Lot 2526. Yes, there is documentation that proves the Saugeen Band willingly paid to use the area between the Sauble River and the dividing line of Lot 2526, the exact same area Mr. Huff described. The license also stated that this license is given for the whole band, and on the understanding that they will neither sublet nor take white men into partnership. The statement about white men being made move off the strip in the Huff letter appears to be a misunderstanding on Mr. Huff's part. Rather than white men being made to move off the strip, the license says they were not allowed to enter into partnership with the Saugeen Band, or sublet any portion of the licensed shoreline from the Saugeen Band to fish. By the wording of the license, white men were not allowed to fish 5 miles out on Lake Huron from the shore at the dividing line of Lot 2526 to the Sauble River. Because the term white men is used in the Special Fishery License, and it is used again by Mr. Huff, it creates a second connection between these two documents. Furthermore, Mr. Huff never mentions who told him of this condition to his lot. Nevertheless, if there was such a requirement, it was not mentioned in the Crown Patent to make it legally binding. The Crown Patent makes no mention of an Indian Reserve in front of Lot 26, because there wasn't an Indian Reserve in front of Lot 26. Indian Affairs were advertising and selling the lots from Lot 26 to Lot 31 as going to the water's edge. In 1910, 22 years before Livingston Huff's letter, a letter was sent to the Department of Indian Affairs regarding the sale of the north half of Lot 31 from a Mr. Ferguson, an Indian agent stationed in Wyerton. In the letter, he states that there is very little value in the lot as farmland. However, he adds, it has its value from the fact that it abuts on Lake Huron and has a nice bathing beach in front thereof, meaning the westerly limit of the lot extends to the shore of Lake Huron. This does not match with Mr. Huff saying the strip of land that was part of the Saugeen Reserve extended all the way to the Sauble River. If that were true, the north half of Lot 31 could not extend to the shore of Lake Huron, as Mr. Ferguson stated. Regardless of any speculation as to the hearsay of Mr. Huff's letter, the reply from the Department of Indian Lands and Timber to Mr. Huff is very clear and confirms what Mr. Ferguson was saying in his letter. Their reply states, as the department disposed of its interest in this lot by Crown grant many years ago, it is precluded from taking any action at this date. Any normal accretion would, of course, go to the purchaser or his assignee. So it certainly wasn't the government that told the white people to stay off the strip of land from Lot 26 to the Sauble River, and more likely it was the Saugeen Band themselves. The content of Livingston Huff's letter cannot be substantiated by anyone or anything, making it hearsay. Regardless, the government response dispels any question that the portion of land Mr. Huff describes was ever part of the Saugeen Reserve. This is another example of Anak manipulating facts. They are trying to make it sound by the content of Huff's letter that it is common knowledge in 1932 the Saugeen Reserve runs north of Lot 2526 to midpoint Lot 31. There is absolutely nothing official to support or substantiate this conclusion, and further evidence from Anak's own predecessors of that time shows Mr. Huff is misinformed. If this were not enough, the Saugeen Band's own council minutes confirm that the band is very much aware that they do not have ownership of the area described by the special fishery license. In 1882, they passed a motion to have their Indian agent, John Creighton, ask the department to have the Sauble fishing station given back to the band. The Sauble fishing station is described in the special fishery license as the shoreline from the north side of the Sauble River to the dividing line of Lot 2526 and 5 miles into Lake Huron. Yet another reference to Lot 2526, coming 20 years after the signing of Treaty 72, confirming that the Saugeen Band knew the northeast corner terminated at Lot 2526. There is even evidence that a Mr. Plummer was trying to have a shoreline reserve created, but there is no evidence that he was successful. From the time he started his campaign, and for another 2 years until 1884, the special fishery license was the only thing that gave the Saugeen Band any privileges north beyond Lot 2526. There is no further documentation in regard to a shoreline reserve being created, or the special fishery license being extended. The special fishery license did not include land at the shore for the Saugeen Band's use. It included from the shore out into the lake for 5 miles, nothing from the shore in and onto land. This would explain the phrase "precluded from taking any action" in the response to Livingston Huff in 1932. By 1858, many lots had been sold north of Lot 25 to the Sauble River, including Lot 28. Lot 34 was sold in 1871, and lots 27 and 29 in 1881. With all these lots already sold, the government would have been precluded from creating a shoreline allowance for the Saugeen Reserve in 1882. Regardless, the shoreline allowance, had it been created, was not intended to be a reserve of ownership for the Saugeen Band. Its purpose would have been this, as stated in Mr. Plummer's letter. The object would be not to prevent the settler free access to the water, but to secure the right to the Indians to land and cure their fish. The first line of Mr. Plummer's letter also confirms that it is common knowledge that the lots end at the water's edge, and that the special fishery license does not include access beyond the shore and onto the lots. Plummer states, "My attention has been called to the fact that some of the lots between lots 24 and 34 in Concession D in the township of Amabel have been sold for actual settlement, and that some of the purchasers thereof have interfered with the Indians in their fishing operations. The Indians' fishing ground is in front of these lots, and they cannot carry on their work without trespassing thereon." In other words, the Saugeen Band had a license to fish in the lake between Lot 26 and the Sauble River, but they had nowhere in the same area to land and cure their fish. This was Mr. Plummer's concern. A document describing the lots between Lot 26 and Lot 48 in Concession D contains basic details about the lots. It includes the sale number, the date of the patent reference number, and a small blurb about any restrictions to the lot. The earliest patents from 1858, most specifically Lot 28, stipulate that the lot owner must provide free access to the shore for all vessels, boats, and persons, making it clear the lots go to the water's edge. Lot 28 is one of the lots that makes up a portion of the beach the Saugeen Band are claiming. The later patents were shortened to establish that there is no reservation for a road allowance along the shore. The only exception is Lot 34, where there was a road allowance reserved along Lake Huron and the Sauble River. Rankin's final map shows all lots ending at the water's edge. So without any reservations applied to the lots, they all end at the water's edge, with the exception of Lot 34. Rankin's final map confirms it, the Special Fishery License confirms it, Mr. Plummer's letter of 1882 confirms it, Mr. Ferguson's letter from 1910 confirms it, and the reply to Livingston Huff in 1932 confirms it. Even the Saugeen Band's own council minutes from 1883 confirm it. The abundance of documentation prior, during, and subsequent to the Rankin survey that confirmed the location of the northeast corner of the Saugeen Reserve at Lot 2526 demonstrate the selective research process of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. Allow me to explain the significance of Schmaltz's description of events in relation to Canada's pleading in support of Saugeen First Nation. Recently, I have been making inquiries to Crown Indigenous Relations and the Department of Justice as to how they can continue to support the Saugeen First Nation argument based on the fact the treaty terms match Rankin's final map. Eventually, after being sent through a number of channels, I was sent what I considered a very patronizing letter from Canada's lawyers. In the letter, they ignored all the questions I was seeking answers to. With no attempt to hide their evasiveness to 5 very direct questions I had asked, they simply explained in a tone of indignant arrogance what Canada's position is regarding the Saugeen claim. They drew attention to their main pleading point, that it was the common intention of the treaty parties in 1854 that the stretch of beach that has become the subject of dispute was intended to be part of the First Nations Reserve. Well, thank you very much. As if after 30 years I don't know what Canada's position is. However, this was a timely reminder considering the boundary dispute account given in Peter Schmaltz's book. I have pointed it out in this video, and for the last 3 years I have been trying to point it out to the indignant Canadian government that it was not the common intention of the treaty parties in 1854 that the contentious stretch of beach of today was to be part of the Saugeen First Nations Reserve. It was not even an intention the Saugeen First Nation of 1855 were even aware of. As it turns out, it was not even the intention of Lawrence Oliphant and Indian Affairs. Peter Schmaltz's account of the boundary dispute is absolute confirmation that right from the beginning, Copway Road was the agreed-upon location of the western boundary by both treaty parties, Saugeen First Nation and Indian Affairs. It is therefore conclusive that it was not the common intention of the treaty parties in 1854 that the beach area from Lot 26 to midpoint Lot 31 was to be part of the Saugeen First Nations Reserve, as Canada claims. It is also conclusive that the amended treaty instructions match Rankin's final map, and the reserve boundaries we know today are the boundaries that honor the treaty terms. The only thing that will forever remain inconclusive, and could be more correctly defined as a manipulation of the facts, is the federally supported Saugeen First Nation claim to Sauble Beach from Lot 26 to midpoint Lot 31.